Story 1. The Battle of Karansebes, which took place on the night of September 21st to 22nd, 1788, is often cited as one of history's most infamous friendly fire incidents. During the Austro-Turkish War, the Austrian army, while scouting for Ottoman forces, mistakenly engaged in combat with itself. This confusion led to significant self-inflicted casualties and chaos within the Austrian ranks. The incident began when a group of Austrian hussars, having bought alcohol from local traders, got into a dispute with infantry soldiers. The situation escalated when shots were fired, and cries of "Turks" spread panic through the camp. In the ensuing chaos, different units of the Austrian army fired upon each other, believing they were under attack by the Ottomans. The Ottomans took advantage of the disorder and captured the city of Karansebes without facing any real resistance from the disorganized Austrian forces. This event is often remembered as a tragicomic example of military miscommunication and the perils of poor discipline. Story 2. Switzerland bombed and invaded Liechtenstein on accident. Story 3. One story that always sticks out as a Brazilian is the Battle of the Porpoises. From Wikipedia, near the end of the First World War, the ships of the Brazilian Naval Division for war operations received orders from the British Admiralty to move to Gibraltar. Admiral Pedro Max Frontin, commander of the cruiser Bahia, was warned to be careful while under operations, as the pre-dreadnought battleship HMS Britannia, designated to scout for the Brazilian flotilla, had recently been sunk by a German submarine. German submarines posed a significant threat at the time, with a potentially large number of them being present in the area. During a night patrol, the watchman in the crew warned of a sighting of a periscope in the water. Fearing a potential German attack, the crewmen began firing upon the ocean blindly, trying to defend themselves from the German submarines. The waters turned red after minutes of continuous gunfire from the ship's artillery. What was initially thought to have been a German submarine periscope was, in reality, a shoal of porpoises. This was only determined after observing the bodies of the cetaceans floating on the surface. Edit summary. The crew mistook porpoises for scopes from German submarines and blindly opened fire, killing a family of porpoises. Story 4. Declare war on China over them not wanting to be addicted to opium, basically causing the collapse of the Qing monarchy and the start of the Chinese civil wars. Story 5. Oh boy, it is with more shame than ever. And no, I do not live in a poor country. They ran out of bullets, and the soldiers had to scream "bang bang" and shoot without bullets during practice. Story 6. I'm Australian. Our country originally wanted Japanese-designed submarines, but then decided we didn't like them and got a big contract with the French. Then we decided we absolutely needed nuclear submarines to protect against China and broke our contract with the French, upsetting them to buy $10 billion of nuclear submarines, which we have no one to maintain, from America, upsetting China. How we managed to simultaneously antagonize so many countries amazes me, and it's an obscene amount of money for Australia considering we spent around $2.5 billion on climate change over the same period. Story 7. Building Zumwalt destroyers and not affording the ammunition. Building 3 Seawolf submarines and then deciding they cannot afford them. Building Freedom-class frigates which don't work as planned, and then building more. The United States wastes more money on its military than most other countries spend in total. Politics probably plays a big role, though. Story 8. Try to conquer Britain by making a thing named the Invincible Armada. To do that, they asked anyone who was able to build a boat to contribute to the fleet. The end result. Most boats couldn't even float, and the British won the war easily. A saying says the British only lost one man during that fight, and it was due to a heart attack. Story 9. The Korean War went from "don't do anything, just show force until the communists have moved back to the 38th parallel," to Douglas MacArthur saying, "Actually, I'll invade North Korea just to draw the People's Republic of China into a war, then threaten to use nuclear weapons on China because I don't care if 2.5 million people die." Douglas MacArthur, the embodiment of American bravado. Story 10. The dumbest thing the United States military has ever done? Probably that time we tried to make a gay bomb real. Dumbest thing by any aspect of its government? The cover-up of MK Ultra purely because the Central Intelligence Agency was embarrassed about the fact that it didn't work. Story 11. Canadian here, where to even begin? Not having a serious navy, hesitating at buying modern equipment, saying, nah, let's not pursue nuclear weapons, and in general letting our military fall into the dilapidated state it is in now. I'm pretty sure we can't mount any sort of tangible defensive action. Story 12. The USS William D. Porter, 1. Tore the railing off another United States ship while leaving port. Accidentally dropped a depth charge, causing the rest of the fleet to assume they were under attack by the Germans. Accidentally fired a live torpedo during a torpedo drill. The live torpedo was fired at another United States ship. That United States ship had an important person on board, Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose transportation to Cairo was the entire point of the mission. Failed to use Morse code to signal the other ship to move out of the way. Broke mandated radio silence to report the torpedo. Was attacked by a kamikaze plane which missed and hit the water. They somehow forgot about it and ran over the kamikaze plane, which exploded underneath the ship and sank it. Story 13. During the American Civil War, the general before Grant was tricked into following the Confederacy, which was retreating toward a river, and then massacred when they turned around and began firing. This event led to Grant being chosen to replace the previous leader. This is partly why the Confederacy was doing so well despite being a weaker force. The Union had poor leadership in the military. Story 14. Wasted thousands of troops' lives at the Alamo in San Antonio instead of heading eastward and defending Mexican ranches and cities that actually mattered in 1836 Texas. Santa Anna is generally considered the worst leader non-colonial Mexico ever had, and that's saying something. Story 15. Declaring war on Iraq over a lie about weapons of mass destruction and an untrue implication of a connection to Osama bin Laden. Consequences included killing approximately 1 million innocent Iraqis, squandering all of the United States' moral authority built up since World War II, and making human rights and war crimes a joke in the eyes of the world. Although really, it was all George W. Bush. Story 16. Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. There was no benefit in supporting the country, which hadn't even wanted to change. In my opinion, the Soviet Union and the United States share the responsibility for creating one of the cruelest and uncivilized countries in the world. Story 17. Iraq should never have invaded. In Afghanistan, nation building should have stopped when Osama bin Laden was eliminated, and the mission should have been declared accomplished. In Korea, not destroying the bridges across the Yalu River was a mistake. Story 18. Entered a war with El Salvador for 100 days after months of immigration, labor, and land ownership tensions boiled over at a soccer game. Story 19. Canadian Navy. Accidentally shot a rocket and nearly blew up a garage in a populated neighborhood. Fortunately, it wasn't a live round. Story 20. New Zealand purchased a lot of armored personnel carriers and then realized we could not fly them anywhere because they would not fit in our largest aircraft. They eventually worked out they could partially dismantle them and fit one in. Story 21. Battle of Blair Mountain, the bonus army conflict, Vietnam War, 2003 Iraq War, and the surge and pullout before establishing a functioning government-capable military force, Afghanistan withdrawal, and recently shooting down one of our own F-18s. Story 22. Invade Iraq, hang their president, steal the oil, kill hundreds of thousands of civilians, and then lecture Russia about how wrong it is to launch invasions of other countries. Story 23. In America, many people are wising up and refusing to join the army since they do not agree with current conflicts. Watching the Army's pathetic attempts to recruit young naive teens into the military with the classic teacher trying to use Generation Alpha language to seem cool tactic is hilariously dumb. Story 24. Too many to count, but I'd like to throw in accidentally mistaking an Airbus A300 for an F-14 that one time. Story 25. Invaded a country to get their oil back onto world markets while convincing the population it was because they hated our freedoms. And that president got away with it and was even re-elected. Story 26. I once was ordered to push millions of dollars of tools overboard into the ocean and order the same tools and toolboxes because if we didn't spend our budget that year, it would get lowered the next fiscal quarter. America's military will make decisions like that while our own citizens live in poverty and can barely afford groceries and rent. Story 27. ADF allegedly trying to temporarily stop recruiting men to boost numbers of women. Story 28. Heard this from a French soldier. Before 2010, the French army operations in the Sahel were going pretty well. Entering a territory, going from house to house, chasing the local forces, most went away before any fighting, and confiscating the civilians' weapons. Then ensuring the security of said territory, fighting off eventual incoming war forces claiming it back, and trying to find a tactic to expel the scaredy bastards. Then the governments discussed and decided the French should go home, without warnings or preparations. No official forces took over, and the weapons weren't distributed back to civilians, who were defenseless when the rebels came back. They just had to follow the public French map to know where to go. In a month, they expanded their territory further than before the operation. The civilians lived in hell, and the soldiers quit the army. Story 29. Spent years and a whole lot of money building a channel around the main base of the Marine only to have it be tactically obsolete almost as soon as it was finished. I mean, maybe they could not have known, but it certainly was not their finest moment. Story 30. Invaded Iraq. It was not technically a dumb military, but dumb leaders. The military actually destroyed the Iraqi military quite efficiently. Of course, many of them simply went and joined militias. Story 31. The dumbest thing we ever did was think we could run a quarter of the planet from a rainy little island where we cannot even agree on how to make a cup of tea properly. Like, yes, let us tell India how to run their spice trade while we are boiling everything into oblivion back home. Absolute delusion. Story 32. Second Iraq invasion for nuclear weapons that did not exist. George W. Bush and the gang manipulated even liberal opinion writers into supporting it. We didn't learn from Vietnam. Story 33. Just about everything Mussolini ever did laughing my face off. I think the best example might be sending soldiers all the way to Russia with boots that had paper soles and not very warm clothes. Story 34. 60-odd years ago, our government rejected an offer of cheap aircraft carriers from the United States of America. Instead, they refurbished the worn-out carrier we had for the price of 4 Essex-class carriers and then dumped it 2 years later. Then they unified the services so admirals were generals and captains were colonels. Thankfully, the last bit didn't stick long. Story 35. USS Porter has a rather funny history. Asked to escort President Franklin D. Roosevelt to Cairo, as soon as they started to leave port, Porter didn't raise anchor properly, where the anchor raked across another ship and tore off its railings and lifeboats. Then there was an explosion under them in the Atlantic, when the other ships in the escort started evasive maneuvers. Porter radioed the other ships and explained everything was fine. They had simply accidentally dropped a depth charge. It rolled off deck because no one had secured them. This upset everyone for obvious reasons, in addition to their command of strict radio silence to reduce detection because they had the president on USS Iowa. The next day, President Roosevelt asked to see an air defense drill. Iowa let out balloons to shoot down, which Porter also fired upon. The captain of Iowa decided to follow up with a torpedo drill, where the Porter would mock attacks on the Iowa. However, they didn't remove the primers from the torpedoes, leading to Porter actually firing at Iowa. Again, with the President of the United States on board. The captain of Porter didn't want to break radio silence, and Iowa was far enough away to give them a few minutes. So instead of radioing them, they tried to use a signal lamp to warn them. However, instead of reporting torpedo in the water, they accidentally conveyed that they were reversing course. When met with confusion, they eventually broke radio silence to warn them about the torpedo. While the crew scrambled to evade, President Roosevelt simply asked to have his chair brought to the edge of the deck so he could watch the torpedo. Porter was then ordered to report to Bermuda instead of finishing their escort. The inexperienced seaman who forgot to remove the primers was sentenced to many years of hard labor, which President Roosevelt pardoned. But Franklin D. Roosevelt was a Democrat, so for a while after, when the Porter would be greeted with "Don't shoot. We're Republican." Later, Porter was sent to Alaska, and during a New Year's party, a drunk sailor fired one of the 5-inch cannons, the shell landing next to the base commandant's home. The last time the Porter sailed, they successfully shot down a kamikaze. But in a terrible turn of luck, The plane was already moving so fast that it didn't completely destroy itself when it hit the water and sank, but traveled for a while, where it ended up underneath Porter and exploded, lifting it out of the water before it sank over the course of a few hours. But at least that was the last of the bad luck, because everyone on board survived. Story 36. The Turkish army sent 100,000 soldiers to fight the Russians in eastern Anatolia during winter. Eastern Anatolia was the coldest place in the Ottoman Empire at that time. In winter, temperatures of -20 degrees Celsius are normal in that region. Most of the soldiers did not even have a proper coat. As a result, 25,000 Turkish soldiers died before the battle began, freezing to death on Alahukbar Mountains. Story 37. Fought a neighboring country for 8 years and resulted in the same outcome on the map with a devastating economy. 4 years later, invaded another neighbor until the world got sick and fed up. Gathered a coalition of over 30 countries. There are many games named after it. Desert something. You think this is it? No. Another United Nations accused us of 3 demolished buildings that went south and stuff melted. They invaded and we lost. The funny thing is another neighbor got the best of the deal, and now our government is run by them. So we unwillingly joined their coalition. You could call it axis of something. A couple of years later, we got some black-dressed fanatics, and the coalition that invaded us helped us defeat the black-dressed orcs. Oh yes, we had a guy that ruled us for 35 years, playing hide and seek in a hole. His son was a bit off. He was last seen at a barbecue, where he is the barbecue. Now we find ourselves between 2 neighbors throwing rocks with engines at each other.